Well, I come to you with fear and trembling um, because though I love to study, I love to learn, I decided to look the impact of pornography and acting out and love addiction and all these kind of addictions, drug addiction kind of operates the same, alcohol addiction kind of operates the same, but to really uh, just to really kind of understand how the brain operates. And to be very fair, 4.5, 5 hours in to try to just put a simple talk together for you here in the whole recovery group of DFR. I just feel like a kid in a sandbox who doesn't understand what's going on. And so I'm going to share with you what I do know, but just don't look at me and say, well, Currie's the expert on that. No, Currie is some version of a novice trying to understand. Yes, I've had, lots of training and lots of courses on this, but to try to really fully understand it became a little daunting. And so, so walk with grace with Dr. Dave today. And I'll try to do this to make some sense. I've called this particular presentation REwired as God intended. Now, we heard the great story of one of our group this morning who has been 1,000 days clear. Praise God, rewired. And that's what God intended. But I want to try to help us understand the critical intersection between addiction recovery, what this man has experienced with 1,000+ days clean, and brain neuroscience. Neuroscience. And so, let's walk in this together. Of course, most of you have heard neurological pathways. And so I want to first of all explain what a neurological pathway is, and to do it and with enough simplicity, but also enough depth and clarity that it starts to piece together and make sense. Because whether I finish it today or next talk, I'm going to talk the implications of this, what we know about the brain and the development of addiction, and how we need to face our recovery, because we're looking at addiction recovery by understanding the brain and how it works better. So a neurological pathway is a series of cells called neurons that connect and interact repeatedly in a sequence that coordinate behavioral, cognitive, and emotional patterns. As they're repeated with reoccurrence, thus repeated, they become more familiar with one another, and like well-worn pathways, thus this neural, which is within the brain, logical. Neuro is actually kind of a chemical electronic signal impulse, neurological, within the brain. They become more familiar, like well-worn paths. And the greater the repetition of this sequencing, the stronger the path becomes. Illustrating, it'd be kind of like, at first, there's a bit of a small goat trail in your brain, but over repeated reoccurrence of the same thing, it becomes like an 8-lane superhighway, as it were. Very, very familiar and a well-worn pathway. Now, the basic parts of a cell or neutron, those words are interchangeable, cell and neuron rather, are the nucleus, the hub of the brain, which is actually where the information is stored and processed. Dendrites, many information receivers, like this dendrite is kind of like the vacuum that sucks in information from other cells. So dendrites are like the receivers of information. And interesting, the more a pattern is sequenced, the more dendrites go out to receive more of the same. So there's the building of the neurological pathway as with repeated behavior, there might have been 2 or 3 dendrites, and it might go up to 7, 8, or 9 dendrites, which is receiving information, basically making the slippery slide into the addiction more easy, more accessible, because it's taking information quicker, because instead of it just being 1 or 2 receivers, there's multiple. Now, remember, there's a series of these cells or neurons to create this neurological pathway. And the other side of the neuron is the axon. There's only one information sender while there's multiple receivers. The axon is the information sender. And the myelin sheath allows electrochemical impulses to transfer quickly and efficiently from nerve cell to nerve cell to nerve cell. And so if you can picture it, there's a whole bunch of receivers, and there's one outline that connects to another cell. All right, so information just to understand. You understand how the growing of the addiction happens, because as the cycle is repeated, more dendrites connect. And so if you can picture it, these cells are linked together when the axon of one cell connects with one of the dendrites of another. And so, yeah. Now, neurological pathways comprised of neurons connected by dendrites are created in the brain based on our habits and behaviors. So the more we do something, our behavior becomes repeated, habitual, etc. The number of dendrites increases with the frequency of behavior performed. So I said that already. Check this out. There are approximately 100 billion neurons in the brain. So little diagram there on that page, there's about 100 billion of those in your brain. Well, some of you only had 50, I know you, but just kidding. But 100 billion. Okay, but this is the crazy thing. With these 100 billion neurons in the brain, these little information pods, there are over 25 quadrillion potential routes any single thought could take. And that's no surprise that every neurological pathway that you have is unique to you, as unique as your fingerprint. Just think about how amazing God has created you to be. That is 25 with 15 zeros after it. 15 zeros. So it goes billion, trillion, quadrillion as far as options. And so, but what's interesting, it's not just the number of options. With the repeating of the same sequence, that particular pathway gets stronger. I'm going to use the word more familiar. The more I studied, it's not like it gets bigger and bigger and wider, and like you have like one big cord this big in your brain, that neurological pathway connected to your addiction. It just becomes more familiar, more popular, more frequented, because it's such a repeated, strong pathway. The little diagram below is basically seeing how the sequence works. You know, you have, 4 different cells, or neurons there, with the axons coming out with the bumpy thing. That's got the myelin sheath that carries information to the next one and has the little feeder at the end. And then the dendrites go out and connect to it. Some of you in brain neurology understand the synaptic gap, which is when 2 nerves come together, there's a bit of a gap left, but there's a chemical that connects, electronic chemical impulse that crosses the synaptic gap. And so it's funny because they don't really touch and grow together. They just sit close, and there's this little gap that fires almost like electronic signal arcs between 2 wires. Enough to said, except that I'm barely scratching the surface of neurology and how a neurological pathway works. Now, to understand the reward cycle of the brain and its connection to our addiction, hang on to your hats. I'm going to try to explain. We talk often in our world of the PMO cycle, the porn, masturbation, orgasm cycle. True of men or women, true of, frankly, and though we're talking porn, masturbation, orgasm cycle, it's really true of any cycle of addiction that a person may have. But the PMO cycle with regard to our recovery world, repetition creates a strong and vibrant, familiar neurological pathway. The PMO cycle is said to be stronger than the cocaine addiction and shapes your mind and behavior in addictive patterns that over time become involuntary. It becomes impulsive. So then the obvious question is, well, why does the PMO cycle become impulsive, involuntary, and uncontrollable? And it is the pleasure principle. You got to understand the pleasure principle. The brain is wired, this is the limbic system, to avoid pain through fear, to run from anything that is life-threatening, a bad situation or danger. And so what happens is, like, if there is a car veering off the road coming down my sidewalk, the limbic system sees, assesses that, and gives me the startle reflex to just jump and get out of the way. It doesn't go to the prefrontal cortex, which is where the front of the brain, where it does all the reasoning and thinking through. It senses threat so instantaneously that there's an impulse to get out of the way, and I didn't have to reason to make it happen. It bypassed the reasoning center, the prefrontal cortex of my brain, and I just avoided the pain. If I see somebody throwing a rock at me or a snowball, when I was playing snowball fights with my friends, I would see one coming and I would go like this. I didn't say, there's a snowball coming and it's rather large, and knowing that, friend, it's more of an ice ball, not a snowball. I better duck. Meantime, if I'd done that, I would have been plastered in the side of the head. So what happens is this limbic system, primarily originally thought of to be the fear center that prevented us from harm, which is incredible for the sustaining of our race. They discovered that it's kind of multi-purpose or dual purpose, because it's fear center and also pleasure center. Now, so to avoid threats or dangerous situations, instantly signals are sent, and it even bypasses the prefrontal cortex. I don't have to reason about it. My body just does it. My brain just does it. Now, the brain is also wired to pursue pleasure through delight, to run to, not run away from, but run to or repeat behaviors that feel life-preserving, not life-threatening, life-preserving or enjoyable. Things like food, water, sleep. If I'm hot, I want shade. If I'm cold, I look for the sun. This is automatic. That feels good. I mean, just the other day it was warming and I was out in my orchard and the sun came up from behind the clouds, and just for a moment that feels so good, because it was a little chilly, and all of a sudden the sun came through and it came down and beamed on me. Well, repeated behavior. Why do you think we go to sunny locations? Because we enjoy that. So social connection, we're drawn back to people. That's how love is created, because we're drawn to things that we enjoy, that are bringing us pleasure, and thus sexual release is part of that. And you understand, eating and drinking and sleeping and sexual release are all part of the human function of reproducing mankind and sustaining the whole of humankind. And so God, in his brilliance, created this. We're drawn to enjoy, i.e. taste buds, the joy of sleep, the joy of sun, the joy of shade if it's cold, the joy of social interaction and connecting with people, the joy of loving and giving love, and also the joy of sexual release. God created all this in us. This reward center is the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and yes, new words to me, located in this lower central part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is here, all different parts of the brain and storage, this and that are all over. But at the top of the brain stem that comes from the spinal cord is where this VTA area is. Now, the reward path, stay with me. Come on, stay with me. There are such good implications to understand this. The reward pathway of the brain is connected to areas of the brain that control behavior and memory. So this VTA area, these neurons release dopamine to make you feel pleasure. And the brain begins to make connections between the activity and the pleasure. And because the dopamine is secreted, electronic chemical, in this case, more chemical hormone secretion, ensuring that you will want to repeat the behavior. Having that hamburger, you want to repeat that. Now, sometimes your prefrontal cortex says, you've already had 3 hamburgers, maybe you should stop. I mean, maybe it's going to say that after 1, but I'm just saying how it works. But the brain begins to make a connection between the activity and that felt good, and it ensures we repeat that cycle. Sleep, oh, that felt good. I'm going to go sleep again. I just, sleep off this headache or whatever. Sometimes the pathway is helpful, but other times it can be very devastating. For example, with certain drugs, they can trigger the reward pathway, and over time, an addiction can develop. So let's understand why this PMO addiction, the sexual addiction, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, etc. Understand why it gets so powerful. And remember, I'm learning with you here. I just happened to study it 4 to 5 hours recently. And so work with me on this. But this is what's interesting. When the limbic system is fired, the reward center is fired, dopamine is signaled and released, secreted to the other areas, regions of the brain for coordination of effort and for strengthening of something that is pleasurable. The amygdala controls and assesses emotions, feelings, and sensations. So, oh, wow, that was great. Woo, unbelievable. Okay. Amygdala. The nucleus accumbens controls motor functions. What actions do you need to do to repeat that pleasure? So instantly, because the dopamine goes to the nucleus accumbens, I go, I think I'm going to get up and I'm going to buy another hamburger. Because you see, what happens is the dopamine hits my actions and I actually want to do something. I want to control my body to have a repeat of that. And of course, you may have experienced it where you repeat behaviors again and again, like the PMO cycle, because when the dopamine hits the nucleus accumbens, what action do I need to do to repeat that pleasure? Now, at first, the prefrontal cortex is involved in the pleasure because this is the reasoning part. The frontal lobe is the reasoning part that goes, I'm going to focus in on that. That was good. And there's the focused attention, and it plans actions because it's the kind of the CEO of the brain. And it says, I will do that again. Now, there's going to be a time down the road that the prefrontal cortex says, this is not really that good for me, whether it's the 4th hamburger or the 2nd or whatever, or whether it's, say, acting outside my marriage. Because the prefrontal cortex is where moral boundaries are, where reason is, where boundaries exist, where thinking of other people and being empathetic, that exists there. And so the prefrontal cortex at first is involved in the addiction because it says, I'm going to focus in on this. This is so good. And so there's a focus happening from the prefrontal cortex because the dopamine shot there after the PMO cycle. And it plans actions to kind of repeat that. The hippocampus controls the function of memory. How did I feel so good again? Oh, I remember how I do that. That was so good. I'm gonna drive down this street. I'm gonna go to that restaurant, and I'm gonna pull up to this window, and I'm gonna say, I would like a Big Mac. And it happens, and it remembers how we got there, what's going on, and so these 4 regions are all pounded with dopamine when you have this sexual hit or any other addictive hit that is pleasurable. And the addiction deepens because all of these different regions pumped from the limbic system dopamine surge are all part of the growing addiction cycle based on the reward principle. So the reward central coordination says, this was good. Let's do that again. And all of these regions play their part in strengthening the need to repeat the behavior. All right. I hope you're still with me. Let's keep going. So dopamine. Dopamine is like motivational dynamite. It's often known as the feel-good chemical hormone of the brain. It gives you a sense of pleasure. It also gives you the motivation to do something again when you're feeling pleasure. Dopamine is sent to various parts of the brain to coordinate the repetition of pleasurable behavior. Thus, the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, hippocampus are all extensions of the limbic system that reinforces, do this again. That was good. Okay, so what happens over time? Your brain on porn. Well, first of all, atrophy. And gentlemen, from here on in, this talk is going to get a little rough because you can see that I haven't finished the notes. Up to this point, I'm tracking pretty reasonable in my preparation. I likely needed another 2 to 3 hours. So here we go. Your brain on porn, what happens? Well, over time, there's atrophy of the brain. Atrophy means waste away. Like when you put a cast on a leg because of a broken leg, and you take the cast off, and you stand, in a pair of shorts and take a picture of your right and left legs together, whichever leg had the cast on is skinny and ugly because atrophy happened. It wasted away because of lack of use or improper use. It's essentially the degeneration of cells, a gradual decline in effectiveness and vigor of the brain, the neurology of the brain, because of underuse or neglect. So what happens is when the neurological pathway connected to the PMO cycle and our addictions, whatever they are, gets repeated so strongly, so much attention is on the repetition of I need more pleasure like this, so addicting, 2-3 times a day, repeated, that other parts of the brain start to atrophy, waste away due to neglect. Instead of brain impulses moving fast as the speed of light in all areas of the brain, parts of the brain start slowing down, kind of like a clogged drain or like moving through sludge. And so your brain, in other regions of your brain, it starts to atrophy, slow down, waste away, while the PMO cycle and the reward system, that particular neurological pathway gets more familiar, more stronger, more habitual, and strengthened. So what happens is there is actually physiological, verifiable evidence by brain scans, CAT scans, imaging, MRIs of the brain, that parts of the brain shrink because of the high central focus of the addiction. Parts of the brain shrivel, they decline, they wither, they deteriorate, they waste away. And this one is more the shriveling, not the slowing down. It becomes actually smaller in size and kind of deformed, not well-rounded, but distorted and gimped. And if you want to look at the next photo, there's a healthy brain here that has that greeny pink one. And then you can see the brain on heroin, and you can see the brain on porn. Well, these are imaging, you know, from an imaging machine where you go in and it takes a scan of your brain, and this is what comes out. And by the way, I have a link at the bottom where you can jump on and watch two really helpful videos. One is a doctor, neurologist that explains this, and this was his pictures. It's like about a 2 to 3 minute video. The other one is actually from the Con research, and it's kind of a simple version of how the reward pathway goes. And I got much of my thinking from that. So you see now we have your brain on porn starts to atrophy, slow down, and actually starts to shrink and get distorted because of hyperfixation on one thing. Interesting. In a sane moment, when your prefrontal cortex is operating, which is your reason center, your value center, your belief center, your empathy center, it's all up here. When it is operating, you're saying, I shouldn't be doing this. Yes, it's pleasurable, but this is going to harm my marriage. This is, this is going to impact my relationships. It's actually destroying me. It's making me feel disconnected from God, because in this process, my mind is not in neutral. I'm either looking at porn, masturbation, orgasm, or I am fantasizing the FMO cycle, where I'm thinking about, objectifying other people, whether it be on a screen, or a video or on a movie or whatever. I'm objectifying people and I'm using people, and your inner value system, God created us to treat people well, that we want to treat people well, that we shouldn't use people. And so what happened is the stronger the addiction comes, it actually trumps the prefrontal cortex, which originally was used in the addiction to, let's get focused on this. Let's plan how we can do this again. So initially, the prefrontal cortex was used to strengthen the addiction. Then pretty soon, we don't want you around anymore. We want to keep doing this addiction. And so there's a moral dysregulation, meaning I'm going to cut out the prefrontal cortex from the reward center, where the limbic system no longer sends dopamine up there to the front of the brain, which is reasoning and morals and values and empathy. And so what happens is the reward center, the limbic system that fires out the dopamine when this action is occurring, it hijacks the control center of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, the reasoning, empathy, moral center of the brain, the planning center, the CEO. It hijacks this, and thus it hijacks the choices of behavior. And the goal is simply shut up and give me more dopamine hits, because that feels good. Dopamine hits, dopamine, give it to me, dopamine. And the reasoning part of your brain, the moral part of your brain, the empathy part of your brain, the other centered part of your brain is canceled, and thus fully addicted. New neurological pathways are driven by the porn's reward center, and they're fired consistently bypassing the prefrontal cortex, the value morality part of the brain. And so the longer we're in the addiction, we get more callous, we get more self-centered, we get more emotionally immature, thus emotional adolescence. I mean, you can be 55 and you can be operating as emotional adolescent because the repeated cycle has shut down the access to the prefrontal cortex. You see, the once CEO of the brain gets displaced, gets ignored, and gets cut off from your reoccurring behaviors and thoughts, the PMO cycle. So if you want to slide down to the next picture, and I apologize for gaps in my handout, but again, I wasn't done. So the prefrontal cortex, just see what it's designed to do. This is how God has created us, how he has wired the brain. When it says in Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Like the body is so amazing. Every time I was there for the birth of one of my 4 kids, I looked and I saw this baby take its first life, and I saw this little 7-8 pound creature had a complete neurological system, had a complete oxygen system, had a complete digestive system, had a complete motor skill system. It was all there, and it was all in 8 pounds. It was all jammed in there, and everything is fully operational. It's a miracle. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. And so the prefrontal cortex is designed to strengthen, where it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. It's actually the renewing of your prefrontal cortex. So when you read scripture, when you're accountable to one another, when you focus on others and their needs, because Jesus said that love is putting someone else first. It's thinking of them. That's all registered in the prefrontal cortex. And it doesn't mean that the limbic system is bad, because the reward center actually tells me I have taste buds to assist the reward center, because if I enjoy something, I'll eat more of it, and that'll sustain my life. Sleep is enjoyable. It's rewarded. We need to sleep, 7-8 hours a day on average to stay healthy. So it's enjoyable. Oh, I fell asleep. It felt so good this morning. Okay. Anyway, so the executive human brain functions, the prefrontal cortex, considering, look at the different aspects of it that are lost when our addiction takes over. See, because I'm allowed to consider future and I make predictions. If I do that, that'll happen again. It allows me to focus, to stay focused. It allows me to organize my thoughts and problem solve. It allows me to form strategies and make plans. It allows me to inhibit inappropriate behavior and actually initiate appropriate behavior. That's not good to do. That is good to do. The moral side, the right and wrong. It's simultaneous considering multiple streams of information when faced with complex and challenging situations. And it's the CEO that says, okay, based on this, the best decision is this. It foresees and weighs possible consequences of behavior. So with the prefrontal cortex, when it's operating well, it goes, if I keep doing this, I'm going to lose my marriage. Well, if the addiction is winning, it's shut off the prefrontal cortex, and you keep taking those drugs, you keep doing the PMO cycle, you keep acting outside the marriage, because until you get the prefrontal cortex back involved and engaged again, and your body is simply a pleasure-seeking behavioral response machine, you will stay in your addiction. See, the prefrontal cortex allows you to shift and adjust behavior when situations change. And it actually allows you to monitor and modulate intense emotions that are strong. But I can say, well, listen, even though, like on a marathon, I have run 4 of them, and you're getting to the wall at 21 out of 26 miles, and your body is screaming, but the prefrontal cortex empowers your will to say, I will not stop. My daughter running in the first one, Dad, you can make it. Dad, come on, Dad, don't quit now. We're so close. Dad, you can make it. And the prefrontal cortex says, dang right, I can make it. And it cuts out the fact that my knees are aching, my chest is sucking air, my body is exhausted, I've run out of calories, and yet I'm going to keep going. That's the prefrontal cortex. You see, when the prefrontal cortex is operating, impulse control is possible. You delay gratification. I'm not going to do the PMO cycle. I'm going to love my wife and build a healthy sexual intimacy with her, and I'm not going to be driven by this. We can balance short-term rewards with long-term goals. And so I don't have to have immediate gratification. I can say, no, I'm going to hold off. This is part of like a balanced diet. I tell people it's pretty simple. Don't eat after 6 o'clock at night and have only one average size helping to your meal, no seconds. And if you need to really cut out desserts and other things that are obviously sugary and fatty, but just stay with that. So what happens, the prefrontal cortex has this ability to balance short-term rewards. Oh, it feels so good to have another burger, versus long-term goals. It's not healthy for me. I want to be an older gentleman that can run with my grandkids and play with them and have fun with them instead of being in a wheelchair at 68. So there's some fun things here. Now, can you learn? Can you increase plasticity? So look at number 8 before I go to number 7. The miracle of God-inspired plasticity. Do you remember there is 25 quadrillion possible pathways that the brain can take in its 100 billion neurons? 25 quadrillion. And so what happens is the PMO cycles become a very dominant, very familiar superhighway in your brain. But plasticity says, I can actually establish new and strong neurological pathways that actually re-engage my prefrontal cortex in these high executive functions that we just looked at there. Plasticity. The brain is the only organ in the body that can change. Heart doesn't change. Kidneys don't change. Lungs don't change. Nothing else changes, but the brain has this unbelievably and God-created plasticity that allows the whole sequencing of inappropriate behavior to be changed into healthy, God-honoring addictions that make me a man whose prefrontal cortex, my CEO, is cooperating with my values, with God, with other people, with empathy. It's reintegrated. And the beauty of it is God allows me to change. God allows me to change. Patterns that, as was said in the testimony about 1,000 days clean today, I thought I was stuck, that every month I was going to have to just apologize to my wife for acting out again with the PMO cycle. And I just felt so defeated and all, but small changes happened over time because of God saying, you don't have to be stuck in negative behavior. We just got to re-engage the prefrontal cortex, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because you are fearfully and wonderfully made. God wants you to be free. So interesting. Well, how do you learn new behavior and patterns? So there's just an example here. So I'm right-handed. So non-dominant left-handed exercises are excellent for forming new neurological pathways, as well as strengthening the conductivity between existing neurons. For instance, if you're right-handed, which I am, try brushing your teeth with your left hand. Well, first of all, be careful, because you could shove your toothbrush through your cheek, okay? Because you're a spaz at first. You're a spaz at first. All right? But then you try it for a while and you get less spastic. And then if you really want to stretch your neuroplasticity of the brain, try brushing teeth left-handed, standing on one leg. Balance. Well, good luck. First of all, I got to be careful that I hit my mouth, not my nose. And then I got to find the teeth and not keep shoving it, into my gums or whatever. And then trying to do that standing on one foot. Well, see, what happens is over time, just like this is the repetition of learning to ride a bicycle. You crash it first, you don't balance it first, and then you start to get a hang of it, and pretty soon you have a new habitual neurological pathway called bike riding or toothbrushing left-handed, standing on one foot. So that new neurological pathway is really similar, though obviously harder to replace because of the familiarity and the power, the strength of the long-standing PMO cycle. So how long does it take for neuroplasticity to work? Basically, how long does it take to establish a new habit? And it takes, for some, is infrequent as 18 times or 18 days, and some right up to 254 days to create a new habit. But for the average person, we often hear anything from 40 that says creating a new habit takes the average of 66 days if you do it every day. Okay, now, that is a new habit. That is different than the rewiring required to overcome an addiction, so that this incredibly highly rewarded base, because just brushing my teeth different, though I might feel really good because look at me, I'm quasi ambidextrous. But you see, when I include the habit PMO with the reward center of pleasure, the addiction is doubly amplified and dangerous. And so it's not simply a new habit, though new habits start to erode the familiarity of the PMO cycle, that neurological superhighway, over time. But it's harder to overcome an addiction than simply start a new habit. Though new habits are needed to overcome the addiction, it's going to take a while because of the strongly interconnection with the pleasure reward center of the brain. And now this is leftovers. So yeah, I've said already that most of the neurons in the central amygdala are involved in the reward circuit. So that was implied in the discussion of the four main parts. And I've said it a few times, but whether it's Romans 12:2, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, the renewing of your prefrontal cortex. It has been hijacked by the limbic system that has been so rewarded through the PMO cycle that it said, screw you, as it were, prefrontal cortex, you no longer have sway. We're going to do this without you. And so just like fight or flight, the pleasure is automatic and bypasses the prefrontal cortex. There's the first one there will give you a short layperson's understanding of the reward pathways of the brain. It's actually really good. It's only 8 minutes. And then the other one is where the picture came from, where the neuroscientist explains the atrophy of the brain and the shrinking of the brain and where that picture came from. Friends, my goal was to, first of all, celebrate a creative God that makes me so unbelievably complex and yet allows me to change. He allows me to change. The brain can over time, develop new neurological pathways through re-engaging the prefrontal cortex by saying, I'm going to be in God's word. I'm going to do recovery material. I'm going to re-engage my reasoning, my control center of the brain. Matter of fact, technically, I would be saying, Jesus, I give you my prefrontal cortex. Would you make it come alive again? Would you let that, you be the CEO of my CEO center of my brain, Jesus? And I want to be in your word to strengthen my morality. I want to be in your word to strengthen my sensitivity and empathy. I want to be in your word so that my prefrontal cortex becomes more empathetic and caring for others and less selfish. I cannot be driven, Jesus, by the base parts of my brain that are simply reactionary. I need to be a thinking, believing, caring person. Jesus, help me to create new neurological pathways that honor you, that honor you. Okay. I have no idea whether I lost any of you or kept a few of you or whatever, but we're going to talk about it. Praise God for the difference that he makes.